This young man, the future Duke of Monmouth, suffered more grief and distress than most of us experience in a lifetime, and all this before he was even a teenager. He was born in exile to a penniless king without a throne, and a mother who has gone down in history at least as an unhinged woman of very loose morals. He survived a kidnapped attempt, saw his mother pushed and prodded from rogue to villain, spent a time locked in the Tower of London, before finally being snatched from his mother on the orders of his father, the soon-to-be King Charles II. So let's now see what Restoration England has in store for this young boy, the future Duke of Monmouth.
So we left our hero last time in the hands of his kidnappers on the orders of his father, the future King Charles II. The young boy had been ripped away from his mother, Lucy Walter, and placed into hiding. It was a heart-wrenching moment for James, as he was never to see his beloved mother again. While still being searched for by agents of his mother, and after months of searching and rumour, it was discovered he was living at the Oratorian College of Notre Dame in Paris. Residing under the roof of one William Croft, he assumed his protector's name, the third of his life. Unknown to the young boy, he would be given an awful lot more names before long. But despite the evident pain the young James must have been in, a period of relative routine and order came into his life. He was given an official tutor, a Scottish poet and scholar called Thomas Ross. Ross wrote in 1658, "It is a great pity so pretty a child should be in such hands as but them who have neglected to teach him to read or tell 20. He hath a great deal of wit and charm, and a great desire to learn." Monmouth's uncle, his soon-to-be role model and future enemy, James, Duke of York, was not a fan of Ross. He wrote, "Ross flattered the boy and put the thoughts of legitimacy into his head, and would have Bishop Cousin to certify that he had married the king and Lucy Walter." This issue that Monmouth would argue all through his life, that his father and mother were married, would centre around the myth of the mysterious black box. This box, if existed, would contain the marriage certificate of Charles and Lucy Walter. No wonder the young James would want this produced, and likewise, Charles's brother, the Duke of York, would equally want it suppressed. But of the young boy, just 9 years old now, men were already writing of his strikingly handsome face, athletic physique, his debonair attitude, and how he radiated beauty. The boldness John Evelyn had seen in his mother, Lucy Walter, came out in James as well as his love of physical activity and adventure. He was taught by his guardian and tutor how to ride, dance, fence as well as chasing deer, running with the hounds and shooting with a bow. He soon began to excel in all these sports. But as he grew in confidence and ability, Thomas Ross began planting the dangerous belief in the young James's mind. A belief that would in the end lead to his defeat, disgrace, and execution. He drilled into his charge the belief that his father, the future King Charles II, had been married to his mother, Lucy Walter, and that, if his father ever regained the throne, would mean the young boy would be the Prince of Wales, heir to the throne. For our full video on this legend, which made future monarchs tremble, click here or follow the links in the description box below. His father, as it happened, was indeed now getting very close to regaining his father's crown. Despite his failed attempt at the English throne, which ended in disaster at Worcester, he would still regale his young son with tales of battle, of daring, and his miraculous escape hiding in the famous Royal Oak. In December of 1659, Charles visited James and said he had real hopes of being in London soon, and a mere 12 days later, fortune was indeed smiling on the exiled Stuart court. For Charles was enjoying a new life already, being supplied with footmen, maids, a page, a coach, 4 horses, a coachman, and a postilion. As 1660 opened, rumours rippled across the North Sea that General Monk, commanding in Scotland, had crossed the border at Coldstream and marched south. Before long, the palace of William and Orange at Breda was rife with news. Charles had been proclaimed king in England, bonfires had been lit, bells rung, and guns fired. and yet it wasn't until the summer of that year that Charles sailed for his homeland with his mother, Henrietta Maria. The Earl of Wemyss recorded the landing. "I did see her land there that day, and with her majesty comes James, son to this King Charles II, begotten in Breda of Mistress Walters, one of Princess of Orange's maids." In the early days of Charles's reign, the famous diarist Samuel Pepys described the young boy with the leading ladies of the court. He wrote, "Who I perceive do hang about my Lady Castlemaine, and is always with her, and I do hear the queens are both mighty kind to him. They stayed till it was dark, and then went away, the king and his queen, and my Lady Castlemaine, and the young Crofts in one coach, and the rest in other coaches. And these were days of enchantment. James played cards with the queen and her maids of honour in her presence chambers, all dressed in velvet gowns." But even with the excitement of returning home and to be crowned as king, Charles was still concerned with his son and his future. One of the first orders he gave on landing was that James was to be converted to the Church of England without delay. Charles clearly feared that having a son, illegitimate or not, who had been brought up in an Oratorian college and around the famously Catholic Henrietta Maria, could give him many political difficulties. It was a sensible precaution, as the ugly head of religion would rear up with terrifying tenacity during his reign. So as James stepped ashore to his new home, a land he had never been, Samuel Pepys again writes of the king's favourite. "I also saw, which pleased me most, Mr. Crofts, the king's bastard, a most pretty spark of about 15 years old. And already this tall, athletic and handsome youth was stirring up rumours that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What great faction there is at court, and above all is whispered that young Crofts is the lawful son of the king being married to his mother. How true this is, God knows." And the matter that would really hang heavy on James was the attitude of his uncle, James, Duke of York. Pepys wrote, "But I believe the Duke of York will not be fooled in this of 3 crowns." Pepys had spotted the problem the young James and the mystery of the parents' marriage could and would bring. Even in the very earliest days of the Restoration and the Merry Monarch's return, plans and machinations were already underway to fight for the succession. Would family ties unite or destroy relationships in the years to come? The relationship between the young James, the future Duke of Monmouth, and his uncle, the king's brother, James, Duke of York, would be a continual battle for legitimacy and the king's affection. The king himself would appear helpless far too often as these two individuals faced up to each other. Yet the early days of Charles's triumphant return seemed golden and peaceful. Even when the king married his Portuguese wife, Catherine of Braganza, the new queen happily took on a maternal role to the young James. Having lost his mother 5 years before, he was perhaps longing for affection and friendship from young women. Catherine saw how much the king loved his son. She was content to return the boy's love. She may have worn quaint clothes, have dull maids of honour, and indulged in strange convent practices, but she did not mind the son of Lucy Walter being thrust into her presence. An individual the new queen did have an issue with being thrust into her presence was one Lady Castlemaine, but more on her later. The one woman who was drawing most of the king's attention when it came to his son was an ambitious Scotswoman, one Countess of Wemyss. The Countess and her husband had only one surviving daughter, the 11-year-old Anna, who was Countess of Buccleuch, and one of the greatest heiresses in the Three Kingdoms. The Countess of Wemyss was happy for her daughter to be proposed as a wife for the king's son, especially as the boy would surely be given many high titles which could only elevate their own family. The king in turn seemed to be extremely happy with the arrangement at first. It meant real advancement for his beloved son, and secondly, it meant money for the crown in the form of a sizable dowry. Charles wrote to the Countess, which a messenger hurried north. "I am very sensible of the affection which you show me in the offer you make concerning the Countess of Buccleuch, which I do accept most willingly, and the rather for the relation she hath to you." Lady Wemyss could barely contain her excitement as she wrote back to the king. "Most sacred sovereign, I received your majesty's most gracious letter, and by expressions thereof account myself happier than anything else in the world could have made me. But just as the marriage contract seemed to be too easy, the future titles of the king's son were causing friction in and out of the royal household. Charles, of course, wanted his son to have the highest of titles, as did the Countess of Wemyss, who herself was hoping James would be honoured with the official title of Prince of Wales. The Duke of York was obviously vehemently opposed to this, as it would drop him down the line of succession. But despite complaints from brother and mother, the king was adamant that only a dukedom would suffice. After all, the amount of land and money being brought in by Anna, surely that had to be rewarded with high office. The king, in the end, got his way, and his son received a dukedom. In November 1662, the Dukedom of Monmouth was bestowed on the king's son, along with the titles of Earl of Doncaster and Baron Fotheringay. The latter title was quickly altered, as the name of Fotheringay held painful memories of the execution of the king's great-grandmother, Mary Queen of Scots. James still became a baron, but of Tyndale. It seems a lot just before his wedding day, but James was also given the titles of Earl of Dalkeith and Lord Scott. The king concluded that James should take precedent over all men in the kingdom, save himself, the Duke of York, and Prince Rupert. Monmouth, it seems, was soon living up to his rapid elevation. Pepys recalled the young Duke's court debut. 29th of December, 1662. I spent a little while walking up and down the gallery seeing the ladies, the two queens and the Duke of Monmouth with his little mistress. 30th of December. Thence to Whitehall, where I carried my wife to see the Queen in her presence chamber, and the maids of honour, and the young Duke of Monmouth playing at cards. Some of them, and but a few, were very pretty though, all dressed in velvet gowns. 31st of December. To Whitehall, into the ball this night before the King. Of the ladies that danced, the Duke of Monmouth's mistress and my Lady Castlemaine, and a daughter of Sir Harry, were the best. The Duke of Monmouth in so great splendour at court, and so daddled by the King, that some doubt that if the King should have no child by the Queen, which there is yet no appearance of, whether he should not be acknowledged for a lawful son, and that there will be a difference follow upon it between the Duke of York and him, which God prevent. Let us just pause for a moment and look back on the unbelievable life the young James had already experienced. He was born illegitimate, he'd been kidnapped, seen his mother distraught and fighting for survival every day, locked up in the Tower of London, eventually lost his mother, entered into a Catholic college, learnt his father was now King of Britain, converted to the Church of England, heaped with money and titles, and was the talk of the restored Stuart court, and now betrothed to a wealthy heiress. This is more than anyone would experience in several lifetimes, and Monmouth was barely a teenager at this point. And so what still must have seemed like a dream to Monmouth, as we shall now call him, his arranged wedding day approached to this youthful bride. The young couple, for they were young, Monmouth was 14, and Anna a mere 12 years old. As they stood before the Archbishop in the ornate King's Chamber of Whitehall Palace, the gaze of the court and nobility were upon them. Monmouth dazzled with his handsome face and athletic physique, whilst Anna was reported to be handsome, wise-eyed and statuesque. The King's love for his eldest son can be seen in his letter to his sister Minette, the Duchess of Orleans. The King wrote, "You must not by this post expect a long letter from me, this being James's marriage day, and I am going to sup with them and see them abed together, but the ceremony shall stop there." The tradition of royalty bedding on their wedding night was a famous one, and often observed by several members of the court and royal family. But the two newlyweds were too young for a full ceremony. Samuel Pepys also recorded the event. This day, the little Duke of Monmouth was married at Whitehall in the King's Chamber, and tonight is a great supper and dancing at his lodgings, near Charing Cross. I observed his coat at the tail of his coach. He gives the arms of England, Scotland and France quartered upon some other fields. But what it is that speaks his being a bastard, I know not. Pepys's cynicism was perhaps due to the coat of arms not showing the fact that Monmouth was illegitimate. The banner should have included something called a baton sinister, a line running diagonally across the image. This would show that Monmouth's parents, Charles II and Lucy Walter, were not married when Monmouth was born. The coat of arms needed to be hurriedly made, as Monmouth was about to receive the greatest honour his country could place upon him. He was to become a Knight of the Garter. The honours did not stop there. Regardless of his minimal education, the universities of Oxford and Cambridge rewarded Monmouth with honorary degrees, as well as Cambridge treating him with a banquet and putting on a comedy. All of this was much to the king's pleasure. But despite all these honours being offered to the young duke, the finances of the married couple were always to be strained to breaking point. Even given an allowance of £8,000 a year, roughly £1.5 million in today's money, as well as a substantial income from Anna's rents, the couple were soon in debt. To give a glimpse into their reckless expenditure, furniture for their Grace's chamber, £1,563, 10 shillings and 2 pence. Pair of earrings set with diamonds, £1,200. £10 for hats, £9 for periwigs, £15 10 shillings for a gold fringe, £11 11 shillings for a privy seal. Alongside this, they needed to rent lodgings at Whitehall. There were horses and coaches, servants, pages, grooms, gardeners, housemaids, valet, a barber. The expenses were unending. Even though he was the king's son and the king's favourite, he was still summoned before the court of Westminster for non-payment of £400 for the paving of the street in front of Monmouth's door. So having been married only 2 years, the couple were deep in debt. So much so that a commission was introduced consisting of Lord Arlington, Monmouth's former guardian Croft, and Lauderdale to manage their finances and to clear their debts. And yet, even with their glittering worlds about them and having their every whim catered for, the couple were never very happy. Anna was bookish, serious, and compared to Monmouth's gallant and leaping character, could have been cold. He sought out adventure, physical activity, and the cheers of the crowd. This marriage of state might not have been the happiest, but they did share one passion, and that was music. The king himself was a renowned dancer, but even he was enchanted by how his son moved on the ballroom floor. Pepys again was on hand to record this. He wrote, "The Queen, which I did not know, it seems was at Windsor, at the late St. George's feast there, and the Duke of Monmouth dancing with her, with his hat in his hand, and King came in and kissed him, and made him put on his hat, which everybody took notice of." The mid-1660s were happy days for father and son, and they could be regularly seen in the pursuit of physical activity, hunting, shooting, sailing. It was in this period that Pepys coined his famous description of the young Monmouth. "He is the most skittish, leaping gallant that I ever saw, always in action, vaulting or leaping or clambering." The king also introduced his favourite to the horses. Horse racing, or the horse match, had been dormant during the Commonwealth, and so the king was keen for its revival. He would send agents to the Barbary coast to find the best eastern strains to bring back to the royal stud farms and racing stables. Everything Charles had learned from the old Duke of Newcastle of English Civil War fame, the rules of horsemanship, equestrianism, how to break horses, how to ride, how to train horses, all this knowledge he poured into Monmouth. The young Duke absorbed everything his father had to teach him, and by the middle of the decade, Monmouth was described as a fine rider who loved the feel of a thoroughbred between his thighs. He loved the horses so much that he almost spent as much money on them as his father the king did. Seeing his passion for the horses, it was now that the king began to edge Monmouth towards a life in the military. And although Monmouth was to make his name on the land, he began his military career at sea. Not only this, but under the command of a man who would eventually become his mortal enemy and sign his death warrant. That man was James, Duke of York, his uncle and Lord High Admiral. The Duke of York, who later became King James II, has been seen as a stubborn, arrogant, senseless man who threw away his kingdom through his stupidity. But during the early reign of his brother, he was a heroic figure and a man Monmouth genuinely looked up to. The Duke of York was a military man and had gained immense experience fighting in France under one of the greatest military minds, Turenne. He not only learned how to command men, but he exuded resolution and courage. As York was a pupil to Turenne, so Monmouth became a pupil to York. The great enemy of Britain at this time was not the French nor the Spanish. It was another Protestant nation, the United Dutch Provinces across the North Sea. The Dutch were a rich trading nation, and on the high seas and in colonies abroad, they were to clash with their British rivals. The Dutch had been successfully snapping up Spanish and Portuguese colonies, as well as making successes of trading spices and still lucrative slave trades. On top of this, reports were regularly coming in on Dutch men of war attacking and capturing British merchantmen at sea. Yet it was not all successes for the Dutch. They were not only wary of the strong Commonwealth navy that Charles had inherited, but also worried by the fleet commanders, including men like Prince Rupert. Oh yes, he wasn't just a cavalry commander. The Dutch were also incensed by the marriage dowry given to Charles II when he married the Portuguese princess, Catherine of Braganza. With her came the possessions of Bombay and Tangiers, which the Dutch clearly had an eye on. It was obvious that war was looming. The king himself was against war with Holland, mainly because at the time the Dutch were allied to the powerful King Louis XIV of France. But his brother York, who was sickened by the thought of a republic, was straining at the leash. Along with many powerful men in the Commons and the Lords, they were praying for an opportunity to avenge lost battles against the Dutch. Their wishes were soon granted, and with news that the Dutch were preparing an attack, Charles was presented £2.5 million to outfit the fleet. On top of this staggering amount of money, 1,200 soldiers were seconded to bulk out the fleet. And perhaps surprisingly for the 17th century, funds and supplies were offered to equip St. Bartholomew's and St. Thomas's as military hospitals for the inevitable casualties. With men, money and supplies promised to the king and his war with the Dutch, he was still thinking and worrying about his son. He wrote, "We are anxious that our dear son gains some experience." And so with his father's blessing and accompanied by his constant companion Ross, Monmouth headed for Portsmouth, the home of the navy, and under the command of his uncle, the Duke of York. But what would James, Duke of York, current heir to the throne, be thinking about having his nephew being thrust into his care? Monmouth was not the Prince of Wales, he was not the legal heir to the throne. But already Monmouth was popular, he was Protestant, and Monmouth did believe his mother and father had been married. He himself would always state, "I would be the death of any man that says the king was not married to my mother." York must have realised that his nephew could be a serious rival in the future. How much of a rival, neither he nor Monmouth could ever imagine. But for now, the master and pupil were comrades on board the ship of the line, the Royal Charles. And so Monmouth was flung into the alien, intimidating world of yards, spars, cannon, sails, and the rough language of British sailors. The wait for action, though, was short-lived. Charles declared war on the Dutch, and with 98 ships, the fleet sailed for Texel harbour to bring the enemy to battle. But the Dutch would not be drawn from the safety of their harbour defences, so York and the fleet sailed 10 leagues off the coast, and could only watch as the chain of warning beacons were lit and ran along the coast. But there was no action, and only disappointment. York decided to bring the fleet about and head home. His only prize? 10 merchantmen captured with Dutch supplies on board. So barely with a shot fired, the fleet sailed back to the gun fleet and dropped anchor in the Thames estuary. We do not know if Monmouth was disappointed at the lack of action and having to act as a kind of flag officer to his uncle. Yet his wait was again not long. The wind had shifted, and now it was the Dutch who were at sea under the command of the formidable Admiral Opdam. York did not hesitate. He raised anchor, and with Prince Rupert in the van, himself in the centre, and Lord Sandwich in the rear, they sailed to meet the Dutch in battle. Their rendezvous was to be near Lowestoft. The fleets soon spotted each other, and for 2 days manoeuvred to gain the weather gauge. After the continual and tedious turns and tacks, the Dutch were the first to gain the upper hand and loose the first broadside. But despite this early success, Opdam could not maintain his position, and York managed to pivot the fleet and, attacking line ahead, broke through the enemy formation. As soon as he broke through, he aimed the Royal Charles for Opdam's flagship, the Eindhoven. It was here, amongst the thundering cannon, the flying splinters, death and destruction, that the young James entered his baptism of fire. As Monmouth stood stoically on the quarterdeck amongst this carnage, Lords Falmouth, Muskerry and Richard Boyle were cut down by enemy fire. The battle continued without abating, until Opdam's flagship exploded into a ball of fire. With their flagship and admiral gone, the Dutch turned their ships around and headed for home. York ensued he was with Prince Rupert and Monmouth to report the victory to the king, having left Sandwich in charge of the fleet. The king, though devastated by the death of Falmouth, was delighted that his own dear son had shown spectacular courage under fire. It was obvious to Charles that his son should pursue his career in the military, but it was not to be in the navy, but in the army. Our next episode on James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, will see Monmouth gaining his first command with the embryo of what was to become the British Army. If you missed our opening episode on the Duke of Monmouth and his battle for survival, click here or follow the link in the description. As always, thanks for watching.